Peter, thank you very much for joining us on Hromadske International.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
In the news this week, we saw a video of these nationalist protests in Poland. Happens every year. Lots of people, flares. It's a big deal. But in your opinion, what sort of nationalist sentiment is there in Poland, and what sort of historical factors play into this?
Well, I think that the Polish national identity has always been a very strong issue that has been aggravated or strengthened perhaps by the pressures coming from outside. Historically, it's generally been Germany and Russia on both sides. I think what's interesting about the current situation in Poland, where we have quite a right-wing a government that feeds nationalist sentiment, is that the support is coming a lot from the youth. Whereas, as we saw with the Trump election, for example, young voters tended to be much more towards the liberal, globalist positions, whereas in Poland, actually, it's the youth who are much more supportive of the nationalist stance, and the opposition to this government is coming from more middle-aged people, those who remember perhaps the Soviet past and have memories of the early 1990s stronger, whereas the young people are not falling in line with this.
That's kind of surprising. Actually, usually you expect it to be the other way around, where you'd have the elderly people who would remember the Soviet Union, perhaps the good parts of it, and the youth would be more progressive.
Well, as Churchill said, if you're not a socialist when you're 20, you've got no heart, and if you're not a conservative when you're 40, you've got no brain. I think there's an element of truth in that across the board, that as a rule, young people tend to be more in line with the tenets of which we could broadly call politically correct tenets, in terms of liberalism, in terms of globalism, in terms of tolerance. In Poland, we're seeing, and it's been the case for some time, the opposite of that, and so you've got a parliament now which has a large amount of support amongst young people, which is quite openly nationalistic in its stances.
And what about historical factors? You mentioned in your magazine, Business Ukraine, in the Polish special, that you had this Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth. Can you tell us about that, about the historical features of that and how that plays into society today, or even if it does?
Well, I think it's an interesting issue in general, the fact that it's so unknown, or relatively unknown in contemporary circles. It's common to refer to Ukraine as a post-Soviet society. It's common to think of Ukraine as a former Russian possession, a colonial possession, or even to an extent a part of Russia. I think this is, there's obviously a lot of truth in that, or that is an important part of Ukraine's inheritance. But for hundreds of years, a large part of today's Ukraine was within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a very broad state with a lot of different ethnic and religious national groups within it, grouped around the Polish crown. But it was actually, to a significant degree, quite a decentralized state. The 18th century period, we had actually the very end of the Commonwealth period, we had the Polish Constitution, which actually predates most of the major the other constitutions internationally, and before that, the Ukrainian Constitution, the Cossack Constitution of 1710, 1711, I believe, which were both very groundbreaking democratic documents for their time and period. And I think they have their roots to an extent in this period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. If we look at Ukraine, as a very diverse country in terms of regional identities, I think that has, to an extent, that can be traced back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Religiously as well, the religious diversity, the diverse makeup of Ukraine, the Armenian, Jewish, certainly Polish, of course, but yeah, certainly Polish, but German, Hungarian, Baltic communities. I think that also was gained a lot of momentum during that time, and cities like Kiev, for a long time after the end of the great partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, which wiped Poland off the map as a sovereign state. But for a long time afterwards, Polish was widely spoken in Kiev as Russian is today, and it was a Polish-speaking city for a long time. And this is not the idea that people often think of today as Lviv has a Polish roots. Kiev does too.
Yeah, and in Poland, I read in your magazine that a lot of or Polish people, half of them would say that Ukrainians who go there, they're welcome, they should settle there, they should work in Poland. And there's another half that said, well, they're related to Bandera, we shouldn't forgive these people for what happened so many years ago. So what did you think of this?
Well, no, I don't think you can read. You can be so sweeping as to say half. I think that there are these sentiments. I think it's fair to say that these sentiments do exist, and they are widely represented on both sides of the debate. The experience we had actually with publishing this Polish issue recently was that we had a lot of comments that were very enthusiastic. I mean, we've got to bear in mind now that there's been a huge influx of Ukrainians to Poland over the last 2 years.
Hundreds of thousands.
There's hundreds of thousands. It's almost, if the trends continue to the end of this year, there will be approximately 1 million Ukrainians with legal rights to work in Poland. So if we assume that there is also a significant amount of non-legal or those who are there under as illegal immigrants or as tourists or on whatever other status they may have, the numbers are huge by any standards. I mean, these are the sort of standards that can change a society. If Poland is a country of approximately 40 million, 38, 40 million approximately, if you're talking about 1 million people coming in, I mean, that's a shift. That's going to have a huge impact, and it's going to have repercussions throughout society. Yeah. I think at this stage we can say it's been very successful.
Well, it's positive, isn't it? A lot of companies set up. They have these Ukrainians. They have very good education, particularly in IT. They go to Poland. They work and generate income for Poland. Like the ambassador, he said the same as well.
Yes, so. Very enthusiastic, and I think that was one thing that came out with a lot of my interaction with the Polish community here. They were proud of this, and I think they have every right to be proud that it's a success story that Europe is not talking about, which they should be. We're very much concerned in Europe about Syrian refugees, the whole Arab Spring refugee. It's not just Syria. I mean, it's basically, we've seen that the floodgates have opened to an extent, and people are coming from all over the developing world into Europe, from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Middle East, from even as far afield as Afghanistan, and that's creating huge problems that we talk about a lot. In Poland, they have a huge wave coming from a country at war, Ukraine, and they've coped with it extremely well. So I think that the Bandera thing, of course, is always going to be there, and that's perhaps a separate subject we could discuss. But the fact that it's not been more prominent is probably where I'd put the emphasis.
Yeah, and also you had the Polish government who recognised the Warsaw massacre as well. What did you think of that?
Well, I don't think that. I mean, obviously,
is it provocative? You think?
Well, it's their business. I mean, they wish to do so. They can do so, and it's a historical argument that would require separate airing. I think that Ukrainians shouldn't take it as an affront to them directly, necessarily. I think there's different trajectories here. There's different processes or narratives at work. It's certainly bad timing from a Ukrainian point of view and from a general united Europe against Russian aggression point of view. And I think Ukraine's response to Poroshenko was in Poland for the Warsaw summit in the summer, and he went to memorials to the victims of the Volyn massacres and paid homage, but paid his respects in a very respectful manner. I think was a very important gesture. On the other hand, we've seen the Ukrainian Parliament responding by saying, "Okay, well, we're going to have genocide votes against the Ukrainians who died," because it was a two-way thing. I mean, there were massacres and counter massacres, and the whole thing was, incredibly. It was an incredibly brutal and messy process. I think on the one hand, you've got the Volyn massacre recognition as genocide, and you've got a significant rise of nationalism in Poland that's latching onto this Bandera thing, and you've got in Ukraine, on the other hand, veneration of Bandera, which is putting a strain on relations. On the other hand, you've got the Polish and Ukrainian parliaments recently both issued a joint resolution recognising the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany as the initiators and the responsible actors for sparking World War II, which is the other side of the coin. That's where they can unite, and they've both got a common ground, which is actually, again, it's the other part of this historic revisionism, where they're actually able to say, hold on, these things bring us together.
Yeah. And moving forward to today, just one last question. After the Soviet Union fell, Poland really led the way in economic reforms. even within a year, their economy bounced back. I believe the official
That's
figures.
probably a little bit optimistic, but I hear, yeah, fair enough, fair point, yeah.
So the economy bounced back, but from the experts and analysts that you spoke to for this edition, what did they say? What sort of tips would they give Ukraine? Like, what sort of strategy should they do to follow such a model?
Well, I think the overall sentiment, I would say, was that there was quite a lot of caution about drawing direct parallels. There was a certain resistance to saying, okay, well, we did this, you do that. I think certainly it's going to hurt, and you have to expect that, and you need to communicate that to the people, which I think is an area where Ukraine could do a lot better in terms of explaining why certain policies are being put in place when the short-term implications are very negative for people, and they have to suffer. I mean, we see with the tariff rising would be one obvious example where the policy can be justified, but it's perhaps not being communicated in a very effective manner. That was the case in Poland in the 1990s, and it was a huge political issue for them, and they had to spend a lot of time getting the message across. But I think probably the overriding message is one that Europe has changed a lot. You know, Ukraine is now approaching issues that are in isolation, whereas Poland was one of a number of countries. All these countries were moving down the track towards a clear set goal. They were going into a Europe which was basically more or less welcoming them without. I mean, obviously there were lots of lectures and there were lots of terms and conditions, but essentially they were welcoming them, they were helping them, they were supporting them, and they were saying this is the goal. Ukraine is almost on its own. It's saying, okay, do it, but you know, there's no way we're ever going to let you in, and we're going to bend over backwards to show that we're not going to let you in, more or less. So you know, do it, but you're on your own almost, and that makes life very difficult for Ukrainians. And so I think the emphasis is much more on them to communicate within themselves that this is something that needs to be done for Ukraine.
Yeah, perfect. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.